Ariel Helwani covers MMA better than anybody and working for the mothership. Ariel, let me start. Thanks for joining us. Let me start with the fight itself. Was this a good fight?
Thank you for having me back on, Dan. I really appreciate it, first off. I thought it was a good fight. I thought it was compelling. I think everyone knew what was going to happen. If you would have told me before the fight that you had seen it already and it went into the championship rounds, and then you would have asked me who won, I would have guessed Khabib. And if you would have told me, how he won, I would have guessed, yeah, of course, it was with wrestling. I think some people were surprised by Conor's takedown defense, but his Achilles heel has always been his wrestling or lack thereof, and his cardio or lack thereof. And I think both those things were on display on Saturday.
Was it a good night or bad night for UFC?
It was a tremendous night. Who's saying it was a bad night? Don't listen to, Dana's doing the whole sad dad routine
I know.
But, he's so disappointed in everyone. If this fight gets made again in 6 months, rest assured, all that footage and then some will be used. There's talk of Khabib being stripped of his belt. None of that is going to happen. Yeah, he might get a slap on the wrist. Yeah, he might get a suspension or a fine, 6-month suspension, something like that. But let's not forget, this is a guy who fights every 6 to 9 months. So even if they give him a suspension, what is he really losing out on? This was the second highest gate in UFC history, the highest in the state of Nevada. And by all accounts, it's going to smash all their pay-per-view records. It was an incredible night for the company.
What did Conor make off this fight?
He said that he stands to make around 50 or so million. A dream of his has always been to make 9 figures for an MMA fight. I asked him last week before the fight if he stood to make that. He said he was halfway there. So not quite what he made for the Floyd Mayweather fight, but 50 million. If you would have told me 5 years ago that a fighter in the UFC was going to make 50 million for one fight after the pay-per-view numbers come in and everything like that, and he gets a cut of pay-per-view, I would have called you the biggest liar on earth. I mean, that's just unfathomable. I don't think the entire UFC roster is making 50 million combined outside of Conor McGregor. So this was a very good night for him as well. And in true Conor fashion, he's not hiding from this. He's not going, into a dark place. He's not licking his wounds. He's already calling for a rematch because A, he's that kind of a competitor, and B, he knows how much more money he stands to make in the rematch.
I was curious about this when you had the post-fight and, where Khabib goes into the audience, the camera angle, all of a sudden, there was morality here with with the UFC where they went way, way high above instead of covering it like it's an event. Because remember when Galata hit Riddick Bowe?
Yes.
Jim Lampley did play-by-play of the fight, the melee in the ring. That's what I was surprised at. It felt like, wait a minute, this is in front of you. And they had an overhead shot where they weren't focusing on what was happening, this spectacle. Why?
This is why I love you so much. You are so smart. You get it. Other people don't. Do you know why, Dan? Because that's state-run TV. The UFC is producing that. That's pro wrestling. They don't want you to see behind the curtain, and I couldn't agree more with you. I rewatched that Bo Galata fight last night, and in particular the coverage, and I thought Lampley was phenomenal in all of that and just being absolutely honest. My problem with the UFC and their coverage on television as far as the events for years has been it's dishonest. A year ago, I made this huge stink about a guy named Aljamain Sterling who was brutally knocked out. They never showed him on the mat. It took him 10 minutes to get up. They never gave us an update afterwards. They never told us how he was doing. They never told us that he was discharged. And that's, a small example. But it's because it's dishonest. They want you to see what they want you to see, just like Vince McMahon wants you to see what he wants you to see. So in that moment, this isn't Mike Breen doing play-by-play of Ron Artest running into the crowd, which is what you should do. They are going as far wide as possible and telling you as little as possible. And I don't like that. I feel like in 2018, the broadcasters need to start actually covering the events like they would an NFL game, NBA game, etc. But unfortunately, because the UFC controls all the production, I'm not surprised. I'm very happy that someone like you, who's I'll say like a novice MMA fan, notices that, because that's unlike anything else in any other sport. Unfortunately, in our sport, it's still run like pro wrestling.
Yeah, but who's going to be offended by this? I mean, you're watching UFC. Like, this is what you pay for, don't you?
it's not so much being offended. It's just that they don't want you to see it. So it's the same thing when someone is coming off a year-long suspension for steroids. They won't tell you the real story as to why he was away. They'll just say he was out of action for a year. It's all through rose-colored, same thing. And I hate the comparisons to WWE in the sense that, I would get all fired up in April. I was getting fired up when people were saying, like, oh, the Brooklyn incident with the bus was, scripted. Well, that wasn't scripted, and I think you saw on Saturday just how personal this thing was. But the way they present their show and the way they shy away from talking about the truth is to me a very big problem. In 2018, the audience is smart enough, and you saw that on display on Saturday night because they kept going further back to not show you. And look, everyone has cell phone footage. Everyone saw it eventually. I think it makes them look bad for trying to hide it.
So what happens next?
Well, what happens next is that Nevada will probably, give Khabib some kind of punishment, fine, suspension, but it's not going to be anything drastic. He is not going to get stripped. And Dana said afterwards that, anyone who ran into the cage or threw a punch, if any of those people are on the UFC roster and some are on the UFC roster, they will be cut. Well, to that I'll say, why? You didn't cut anyone after what happened in Brooklyn, and there were people on the UFC roster who were, involved in that incident at the Barclays Center with the dollies and the chairs being thrown at the bus. So you can't do it now. Everyone on this Monday morning wants to blame someone. They want to blame Khabib for jumping over. They want to blame Conor's training partner, Dylan Dennis, for yelling at him. They want to blame Conor for throwing the punch. They want to blame Khabib's training partner for punching Conor. Guess what? Everyone's to blame. From April to October, everyone is to blame. Everyone has some sort of part in all of this, from the way this was promoted to the talk about religion and family and Russian politics. Everyone was to blame. You cannot be surprised for what happened on Saturday. This was very combustible. And so at this point, they just need to move on, accept it. And at some point, I would not be shocked if they do the rematch. And I would certainly not be shocked if all this footage that everyone is claiming to be so upset about is used heavily in the promotion for that rematch.
Well done, Ariel. Good to talk to you again. Thanks for joining us as always.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Ariel Helwani covers the sport for ESPN.
For more Dan Patrick Show, tune to Audience Channel 239 on DirecTV or download the Dan Patrick Show app.